Good morning. Welcome to the Eastman Financial Report. I'm Dan Eastman, your host, and today is May 16th, 2025, Friday, the end of another week. Lots of exciting news today, but we want to thank you for tuning into the Eastman Financial Report and to all the fine programming you see on Worldview Tube. As you know, throughout the day, we broadcast an amazing amount of information, all from a Christian worldview and a Christian perspective. And that's, of course, our ministry and our mission. And our purpose here at Worldview Tube is to bring forth information to that great marketplace of ideas from a Christian perspective. And as you know, we've been broadcasting since 2006, and we've brought a lot of very good information to that marketplace of ideas over the years. And we do that free of charge. We don't have a paywall or a subscription fee. You can watch our content for free. And that's an important part of our ministry. If you think back to the days 2,000 years ago when the Apostle Paul and the other apostles were delivering the gospel, they didn't charge an admission fee, and we don't feel we should as well. Our Christian worldview is important, and it should stay robust, and it should stay current in that great marketplace of ideas. If you'd like to help us in that effort, there are a number of ways you can do that. First, you can go to worldviewfoundation.com and you can make a donation. You can make a one-time donation, or you can sign up for multiple donations. And if you do that, it flattens our revenue curve so we can better match our costs to our revenues and, of course, stay in the black. The address is down at the bottom of the screen right here. It's www.foundation.com. And you can scan the QR code and it'll take you right there and you can make a donation. Another way you can do some support for our work here is to do business with the companies you see advertising throughout the day on our stations, because we don't sell blocks of advertising time like normal media. We partner with vendors that we know and trust, and we believe in the goods and services they offer. So when you do business with them, a small portion of the proceeds comes back to us in the form of a commission, and that again subsidizes our revenues and keeps us in the black, and of course keeps us online free of charge. The third way you can help us out is to go to worldviewtube.com/vault, and you can subscribe to our vault. And this is a new concept, and it's an amazing collection of information. As you know, Brandon's been doing writing books and broadcasting media for well over 20 years, 30 years. And that vault contains a collection of his works, not only his written works, but also interviews with quite a number of Christian thought leaders, some of whom have actually passed on to be with the Lord. But all of that information is available, and it's very, very interesting. So if you're into the collection of our materials, or you'd like access, or you'd like to see reruns from the Eastman Financial Report, all of that is in the vault, and you can certainly subscribe to the vault, and it will be available for you. So that's another way you can help out. So there's three ways. You can make a donation, or you can do business with the companies that advertise on our network, or you can invest in the vault and have access to great content. Well, let's talk about the news. There's a lot of information, and one thing I want to talk about right up front is the University of Michigan survey is out, and it is really demonstrating some extraordinary partisan reaction. And I want to talk about this because back in the day when I was studying economics as in the master's program up here in Milwaukee, the University of Michigan survey was very important for consumer sentiment and the general sense of the public as to where the economy was going. And technically, what we would do is we would look at data generated by the government, and we would compare it to the perceptions of the people to try and determine if the actual data being generated by the government, and back in those days, it was pretty objective data, it was not politicized as much as today, but we would look at that information and we would compare it to the thoughts and attitudes of the general public. And the University of Michigan study, of course, is a very, very well-known study. It's highly regarded and has been very, very telling over decades, because it has the ability to sample the minds of the public and then compare that to absolute raw data as it's coming out. So overall, I have a great deal of respect for the survey, but what I'm noticing, and this has been going on amazingly since November of last year, is that if you break the University of Michigan survey data down into demographics, what you will find is that people who tend to be supportive of the Democratic Party have a much much gloomier view of the economy than people who tend to support the Republican side of the party. So it's really a bipartisan split that is really, really unusual. And as a result of that, the numbers that are being generated by the University of Michigan survey are being questioned because of this partisan phenomenon. Now, to give you an example, if you tend to be on the Democratic side of life, you are looking at inflation expectations in the 7 or 8 or 9% range. When we've been talking all this week about the consumer price index that came out at 2.3% inflation, and we talked, I think it was yesterday, about the producer price index. Why the producer price index is important, because it's kind of a trickle through inflation that affects the price of produced goods and goods. So the point is, if you are listening to news sources that have a Democratic bent or a socialist bent or a leftist bent, you are going to have a perception of the future and the present that is starkly different than the statistical data that's coming out of the federal government. Now, I suppose if you're a conspiracy theorist, you could argue that, well, the government's fiddling with the numbers. We did that actually before the election. There was some very interesting metrics coming out of the federal government during the Biden years that suggested they would blurb out a number for a headline, and then they would quietly adjust the number and correct it the next month or the month after. Well, that's politicization of economic data, which is never helpful for economists and financial analysts, because there's this thought that perhaps the government could produce objective data without politicizing it, and that data could actually be used to make policy decisions that would affect the economy. Well, what this University of Michigan survey is demonstrating is that people's perception of the economy is still very much driven by the media sources in the United States. So if we take a look at the Republican-leaning people, they're not seeing a lot of inflation, and they're not seeing a lot of negative information. They're not seeing negative, high unemployment numbers. And the Democratic side of the sample survey is seeing gloom and doom that simply is not supported by the government data. And of course, the Republican side within this survey are reporting information that is much closer to the actual data being reported by the government. So it begs the question in the United States, and this is why we go back to this great marketplace of ideas that I talk about in the beginning of every show. I talk about how we at Worldview Tube, we are putting information into that great marketplace of ideas from a Christian perspective, while others are putting information into that great marketplace of ideas from other ideological perspectives. So if you are anti-Trump administration and you have a microphone and you put out information suggesting that the inflation will be going to the moon and we're all going to be, destroyed, there are a lot of people who are receiving that information and believing it, and then those attitudes are manifesting themselves within the University of Michigan survey. Now, I'm sure to the chagrin of the people doing the survey, they were, their idea is to sample the populace and the ideas thereof. So what they're doing is very accurate, but it's very interesting to see that split. And it's also interesting to see that on the Republican side of the survey sample, the people who are hearing their news from conservative news outlets, or at least accurate news outlets, are much closer to the statistical reality of today's current economy. So it begs, again, the question, when you're in this marketplace of ideas and you want to bring those ideas forth, the question that the recipient or the shopper within the marketplace should ask is, why am I hearing this? Who's saying it? And what is their agenda? And if you are an honest consumer within that marketplace, you will not want to be hoodwinked or fooled or tricked. You would expect to go into the marketplace and you'd look at the quality and the quantity, and you'd make a decision. Like if you're shopping for apples, you go into the grocery store, there's all these bins of apples, different colors and shapes and sizes, and you look around and you kind of pick the one that catches your fancy, but you want to believe that is the reality is the apple, and it's not a distorted apple. It's not really a plum hiding underneath some apple skin. It's a real apple. Well, this is the interesting thing about the great marketplace of ideas. And that's why it's so important that individual and independent news sources and non-agendaed news sources have access to information. Because if you think back to the olden days in America, where we had three big national broadcast networks, then you had some public television, and maybe a couple of markets had an independent station or two. The news was very much channeled and it was very much controlled by three networks. And of course, if you watched the three networks and you had to toggle between the stations to do it, you'd realize that it was a rather homogeneous news cycle because one news outlet, one of the big three, was reporting the same thing as the other two. Otherwise, there'd be all different confusions. Whose news would you listen to? So it tended to be somewhat homogenized back in those days. And you'd sort of hear the same kind of news story. Not exactly, they weren't repeated verbatim, but it was a consistent message. So the American public, that was their news, that was their source, and they believed it. Of course, you could read the newspapers, but now, of course, the newspapers were owning the broadcast networks. So it was really controlled information. Well, we don't have that today. We're hearing some very interesting and independent opinions, including this show and others and other networks, other programming, that is explaining things that go out beyond this monopoly or cartel of information. And that's why it's so valuable to have alternative viewpoints. That's why this marketplace of ideas is expanding, and that's why we're here doing this. And this is a manifestation of that. You can see the results, and you can see why, because it depends where you get your news. Where do you get your news? Well, you have to be careful about that. And that's the whole purpose of the Eastman Financial Report. What do I do this for? I don't get paid to do this. This is just me giving back and taking the skills I learned and, teaching college and bringing it back to society. And the idea is critical thinking. So when you're hearing about inflation and high inflation and how tariffs are going to set off all these inflationary nightmares, you have to be able to get past the headline to start thinking about who's saying that and why are they saying it and why do they want me to believe that? Because their job is to manipulate you into a thought place where you will react, and Americans react in a very limited number of ways. Number one, you can react at the polling place, so they'd like to encourage you to vote for their ideology and their candidates. And you can, of course, react in the marketplace, and you can select between what was perhaps perceived as being green products versus regular products or healthy, this and that. But that's where Americans effectively transact. And that's why advertising and media and news media is so critically important. You ask yourself the question, why is it that all of these news networks have to have a news program anyway? Who cares? I mean, 24 hours a day, life goes on, but there's always this channeling and filtering of information with the agenda of getting people to think here versus here. And of course, the purpose of this show is critical thinking. You just want to analyze that and say, wait a minute, why am I hearing this? Who's saying it to me? And what's this all about? And that's why this is so very important. Now, one of the interesting things when you look at the statistical data of the tariffs in April, we monitor import prices. That's one of the metrics that economists will monitor. And the import prices metric showed a very modest increase in April in pricing. Now, the tariff thing has been going on since the inauguration in January. And you'd think with the battles going on between the Chinese and the US, and of course the Canadian and Mexican tariffs and all the tariffs around the world, that we would start to see some real impact on prices of stuff that's being imported into the United States. And we don't see it. We just simply don't see it in the numbers. Now, I suppose you could put your tinfoil hat on and think, well, the government's lying to us. Well, I don't know that they're lying to us. You'd have to come up with some proof of that. And even in the Biden administration, when they were exaggerating for headlines, they would quickly correct it for posterity because government statistics are critically important to a lot of people. There's certainly economists worry about it, and we analyze it, and you'd like to offer public policy positions based upon the analytics and analyzing the data. And of course, finance, Wall Street relies on it because they're trying to get a sense of the macro economy, and you want to place your bet or at least take a position, in stocks or bonds or investment position based upon a risk analysis that includes the macro as to where the economy is going. So all of these numbers matter. So if you see the number that says in April, the price of imported goods went up just marginally. Where do you get to tariffs are causing massive inflation to the point where you can truly convince people who lean to the left to respond to a neutral survey? It's a very respected survey. in such a dramatic fashion that deviates from all of the statistical norm. It's hard to believe. It's basically these people are being led down a path by participants in the great marketplace of ideas for a political purpose, and that is manifesting itself out. So it's an interesting problem, and I think it's one that you will certainly want to think about. So let's move on. I want to talk about one big, beautiful bill that is in Congress being debated. And of course, I've been watching this with bated breath to see just how, Congress and our amazing democratic methodology works. And the bill apparently has failed in committee, so that means they're going to keep, working on it. But there's some interesting phenomenon with the bill, and I touched on this a little bit yesterday. The bill is dealing with, of course, setting out the federal government spending and tax policies. And once this thing passes, it should be the platform upon which the Trump administration will go forward with its tax the public and spend the money, of course, unfortunately, still borrow. And that is the public expenditure. And then the question is, how do you tax the public to pay for that? And of course, we have not been successful in doing that. And how do we know? Well, we're running a $2.5 trillion annual deficit this year. That means we're spending $2.5 trillion more than we're taking in. That'd be the first tip. It's not working. And then, of course, we have this pile of 36 trillion, soon to be 37 trillion in debt. That is an accumulation that it goes back, well, frankly, to the beginning of the country, but tremendously since the 1980s and beyond. And that's the proof that our mechanism of funding our government is severely broken. Because what Congress has figured out, and it's a long, long time ago, is that you can spend money on lots and lots of stuff, and you can only tax the taxpayers so much before they start voting for the other guy. So you find that level. Where are the taxpayers? Where's that saturation level or that squeak level? How high can the taxes go? And you stop. And then you say, we don't have to worry about the spending part. We can pass 2.5 trillion more in spending than our tax base because we just borrow the rest and we put it on the national credit card and nobody cares. It's free money, and that's what's happened. So when we look at this, great big beautiful bill battling its way into Congress, it's not even getting out of committee. I mean, this thing is still stuck in committee. What you're seeing is the mechanism of democracy that is so vested in government spending and just basically amazing amounts of dollars being spent by the federal government with no nexus to the actual tax base, that they can't stop doing that because there's no permanent friends or permanent enemies in Washington. There are only permanent interests, and permanent interests have lobbyists, and lobbyists are very effective in taking, your congressman from podunk nowhere America and convincing that poor soul that, they're in a deeper and bigger important role. And, the persuasion is tremendous. And at the end of the day, the people in Congress are really, really stuck with having to vote for what the I don't know, you can say deep state, the infrastructure needs, wants, and depends upon for its livelihood and funding. And that's why it's very difficult to break away from the current path. And that's, we brought in the Doge mechanism because we can go in and use Doge to look for all of the cost savings. And that's great. We should be doing that. We should do that every day in government agencies. But the cost savings are effectively not being offset. There's still more deficit spending than costs. Anyway, I need to take a break here. I'll be right back. Give me a minute and I'll talk to you shortly. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now. And we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
Hi, welcome back. Okay, so I was talking about the one big beautiful bill, and some of the issues that have come out, of course, is we were expecting to see no tax, no income tax on Social Security. Well, that didn't quite make it into the draft, so we're wondering how that's going to play out. I don't think a small tax credit for seniors is going to be politically palatable once you promise them the moon. Another thing is, of course, the no tax on tips. That resonated with a lot of lower income Americans, and we're really kind of counting on the ability to keep all of their money in their pocket so they can better live. And apparently that's not in there as well. So this would be a good time to call your congressperson and say, maybe why don't you do what the president wants? Let's try something new instead of the same old, same old. So we'll watch that. It's quite contentious, and the conservative faction basically killed it off, saying, no, we're not there yet. And also the debt. You really have to think about running a balanced budget because you're just too far in debt. So we'll see where that plays over the weekend. I'm sure it'll be contentious, but we'll watch it. I also wanted to talk about the single-family home permits have gone down again in April, and that's consistent with the builder sentiment that I talked about. I think it was yesterday or the day before. When you look at single-family home permits, and I've talked about this in the past, the process of building a home takes a little bit of time. First, you have to have a lot that's properly subdivided, and there needs to be utilities like maybe sewer and water and electricity and gas, and not to mention infrastructure like a street so you can get there. All of that has to be done and laid out. And then once somebody decides to purchase a home, you have to issue a building permit. The local municipality most likely will issue a building permit. And all of that takes time. And of course, there's a big lag in the time from when a person commits on contractually to purchase a new home and have a home built on a lot until the time the lot is actually developed and the house is standing. But the permitting process is how statisticians and economists and financial people measure and watch that market. We look at the number of outstanding permits, permits issued, and then how many are issued and outstanding. And then that's when it's going to be a deal. When somebody gets a building permit, you pretty much rest assured they're going to put the shovel in the ground and up goes the house. And of course, we're watching that these permits have declined in April. And when you look at the interest rates, they're still at the 7%, a little more, a little less, depending on the market. But nothing has really changed over the last 3 years. And that's why when you look at the building permits for new homes and you look at the interest rates and the high interest rates that have not really budged, it's causing the home building companies a squeeze on margins. I talked about this before, that home builders can't offer an incentive to effectively buy down the mortgage rate. Take a 7% mortgage and you can make it a 4% mortgage or 3% mortgage if you put enough money in up front. The way mortgages are calculated, there's a big down payment up front, not to the seller, but if you effectively prepay the interest, you can buy the effective rate down. And the home developer will do that as an incentive to build a home and sell it to someone. You can't sell it at 7% mortgage, but you can certainly sell it at 3% mortgage. So you buy it down, but that comes out of the builder's margin. The profit margin is the end all and be all in business. If you remember my formula, revenues minus expenses is income. And income divided by the equity is return on equity. And that income divided by the number of shares outstanding is earnings per share. Okay. And that's the model. So if the costs, the revenues minus expenses, if the expense line is increased because you're buying down mortgages for your customers, you're shrinking your margins. And that is an expense in the short run, but it is not sustainable in the long run, because over the long period of time, you have to be able to earn more money. You have to have a higher profit than your costs, or you're not in business. If it's negative, you're losing money. If it's positive, you are effectively you're staying in business, but you want it to be positive on an increasing basis over a period of time. So that's why we watch those statistics. And what it tells us is, notwithstanding the one big beautiful bill and all of the tax goodies that everyone's waiting for, there's a real demand within our economy to have relief for the American consumer, because people are just really struggling with the basics. You look at food prices, you look at housing prices and rent prices and automobile insurance. prices are going up. And if that's why when you look at those numbers compared to the 2.3% inflation number of the Consumer Price Index, you realize that certain elements in your budget are going up a lot faster than 2.3%. And that's where that gets to be reflected. So what it tells you is the demand for single family housing is softening because of the price and the costs, and it is reflecting in the permits. So you can see it. That's what, economists and financial people do. You take a look at that stuff. Okay, I want to also talk about, there's a case at the U.S. Supreme Court right now where President Trump's administration, through the DOGE program, wanted to go into the Social Security system and take a look at who's getting how much money, and they're looking for fraud. And of course, we have heard forever that, I think probably since the Social Security system was invented in the 1930s, this idea was that it was going broke because the demographics require more workers paying in than retirees collecting benefits. And of course, that has shifted with the baby boom generation, although I dare say that generation is working itself through. But the point is we hear story after story, every campaign, you're going to ruin Social Security, you're going to push grandma off the cliff in a wheelchair, it's going to go broke, there's a lockbox, somebody raided the lockbox. You hear all of this stuff about the Social Security system because it's designed to terrify the elderly population who's living on Social Security, or at least enjoying, Social Security to subsidize their lives, and it becomes a real political third rail. You get many, many, many retirees in the U.S. and you scare them into believing that you're going to tank the Social Security system, then they all vote for the other guy. See, and that's basically been a strategy for decades in America, is to use Social Security. They call it the third rail of politics. When you touch Social Security, your political career is doomed. And this is just the way it's been. So we've heard this over and over and over again. The system's going broke. There aren't enough people paying in. People are living too long, this and that. So then it begs the question, why is it a bad idea to use technology to go into the Social Security system itself, its database, and analyze the database to see if there's fraud? And if you see fraud, you can catch the fraudsters and you can stop it, and then more money will stay in the Social Security program, and that will shore the program up so it's not going to be collapsing anytime soon, and you'll be able to take some of that argument off the table. And so that's, of course, what DOGE wanted to do. And then somebody filed a suit, and then the judge said, no, you can't go in there and look. Well, now President Trump has taken this to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the idea is to ask the court, first of all, the president has executive authority under the Constitution. And he's doing his job by being a good and prudent manager. And as part of being a good and prudent manager, you have to go in and take a look at your data, and you have to make sure that everything is appropriate, everything is properly accounted for. And if you do detect fraud, you have to stop it right away. Like if you're running a bank, banks are always worried about fraud, and they have very sophisticated tools, and they analyze their internal data all the time. And it's why sometimes you get something on your phone that says, did you just make a withdrawal or something? They know. They're watching because they don't want any fraud. And that philosophy and that theory should be exceptionally important to the federal government, who is managing the retirements of a vast number of Americans. But yet there are people who don't want you in there. And the question is, why is it? Are they committing fraud and they don't want to get caught? Well, that's a possibility. But more importantly, if you shore up the Social Security system and you can demonstrate that it's a solvent, profitable organization, then you take that political lever off the table and you've got nothing to campaign on next time. So we'll be watching this. It's a very interesting development. We'll see where the court goes. Anyway, I'm out of time for today and for this week. I will certainly look forward to talking to you next week. Have a great weekend, and don't forget to make a donation to Worldview Tube Foundation, because that really helps our ministry and keeps us fresh and alive. Thank you, and have a great afternoon. Bye.
You're watching Worldview Tube, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brannon House.